From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I'm so glad to be here and to see all of you. I'm not going to ask you to stand up now that you're seated, but let's have a show of hands of all the veterans who served. All right. Now let's have a show of hands of everybody who worked on the home front. Come on, Mom. Marion. Now we're going to have a really wonderful panel in just a couple minutes, and so I'm going to encourage those of you who are standing in the back, just kind of waiting to see if it's going to be really good. Come on down, have a seat, because it'll be better if you're sitting near the front and you can hear. So come on and take a seat, and that way you're going to hear from some wonderful people. Now, while we're getting our panel set up, I wanted to add my thanks to many of yours to Congressman Ron Kind, who was just co-moderating the last panel. He was the father of the legislation that created the Veterans History Project, and if he hadn't had that idea, we wouldn't be here. So thank you, Congressman Kind. Everybody in this tent is very special, but I also wanted to acknowledge, and I think he just drifted off, General Don Scott from the Vietnam War is the Deputy Librarian of the Library of Congress, and he's here with us today as well. So welcome to the Veterans History Project Pavilion. This is an historic weekend, and we're so proud to be here with you and the Smithsonian Institution and the American Battle Monuments Commission to honor our World War II veterans. The Veterans History Project is part of the Library of Congress and its American Folklife Center, and it was given the job to collect the first-hand accounts of those who served in wartime, in World War I and World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and the Persian Gulf War. How do we do this? We do this with an army of volunteers. And all the people that you see with this purple t-shirt and the purple hats are here to get your stories on video, on audio tape, or to interview in the interview booth, or to get your story or your memoirs on computer. We do this because Congress created us and because we got some very generous help from AARP, and we're really happy to have them as a sponsor. Now, what do we accept as far as your materials and your memories? We love to hear people's voices and hear them telling their own stories. So videotaped interviews, audio taped interviews, but also wartime letters, your written memoirs, and your photographs, especially if you have annotated them and we know what's happening in the photographs. All the different ways that people tell their stories is what gets collected through the Veterans History Project. And then it's preserved and it's archived in the Library of Congress, where it will be there as long as there's a Library of Congress. A lot of the material is also put up on a website, so you can actually watch the interviews and hear the stories and read the letters on your computers. And if you like to do that and you have a pencil or you have any of our material, you'll see that the website is loc.gov/vets. It's very, very easy to find and to go to, and that way you'll see all the stories. When we collect your story, you're going to join about 18,000 individuals whose stories are already at the Library of Congress, and that represents about 70,000 items. So please be sure you see a volunteer, or you go to the computer, or you go to the back of this tent and get the materials, because you can do this next week or next month or next year if you want to. So I want to remind you that the Veterans History Project is something that's going to go on. It's all the wars, It's all the branches of service, Air Force, Army, Marine Corps, Navy, and we don't forget the Coast Guard and the Merchant Marine and the great service they gave us. We also depend on volunteers, so if you want to volunteer as an interviewer, that would be great too, or if your organization wants to interview veterans. We haven't forgotten the people who worked on the home front. We have a lot of interviews from war workers and Red Cross workers and nurses' aides. So we want to make sure that happens as well. And now I'm getting the signal that it's time to introduce the panel. And I'd like to introduce Commander David Winkler, who's a historian at the Naval Historical Foundation and one of our best interviewers at the Veterans History Project. And he is accompanied by Admiral Holloway and Senator John Warner. They're going to be talking about the Battle of Surigao Strait, but also because these two distinguished gentlemen are friends, they're going to be having a dialogue. And I just want to say that it's an honor to welcome Admiral Holloway and Senator Warner. Thank you for being such a wonderful friend of the Veterans History Project, for supporting us, and for being the courageous chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dave Winkler, and I'm pleased on behalf of the Naval Historical Foundation, on behalf of the Library of Congress's Veterans History Project, to be here in the presence of two great patriots. Both men are naval veterans. In the case of Senator Warner, I say naval because he enlisted in the Navy towards the end of the Second World War, and then you served our country again during the Korean War as a Marine Corps officer.
Yeah, but I'm the only damn fool you ever knew that had to go to boot camp twice. So don't put me out here as some bright character.
And then, of course, you went on to be the Undersecretary of the Navy, and then the Secretary of the Navy. And as Secretary of the Navy, you were kind of responsible for hiring this man here to be the Chief of Naval Operations.
The last act I did, it was during the 5th year, during the Vietnam War, was to reach down in the ranks and pluck this character to be the head sailor. And he did one hell of a job, mister, I'll tell you.
Of course, both of you got your starts somewhere, and that place where you got your start was World War II. And but before I want to talk a little bit about that, I'd like to ask you, Senator, about the Veterans History Project and how you came about signing on as a 5-star member, and talk about a little bit about why you're supporting this program and why it's the right thing to do.
Well, drop the 5-star. I'm Petty Officer 3rd Class. But Jim Billington, a wonderful man who is the top fellow over at the Library of Congress, conceived this idea, and I thoroughly supported it. Because in today's time, Americans should have some record of the sacrifices that so many made to provide the degree of freedom and the strength that this country has today. Each generation has built upon the foundation of the other generation. And I mention that because now, as chairman of the Armed Services Committee, I go back and forth each year, a couple of times a year, to Iraq and Afghanistan and other places around the world where I see this generation out on the ramparts, just as brave, just as courageous, Jim, as our generation. And we may be known as the greatest generation, but let me tell you, I think we're going to pass the baton to this one. Don't you agree, Jim?
I agree, absolutely. I think we sort of didn't anticipate that they would rise to our level, but that was very selfish of us. And now I say so often that I've never known the Navy, which is my service, to be better prepared, more ready, or more capable than it is today. And I sort of have to bite my tongue when I say it, because I was responsible for that readiness in years gone by.
That's right.
Okay, going back to World War II, I'd like to ask you gentlemen, where were you on December the 7th? Admiral?
He's a senior officer, so he gets to speak first.
Don't believe that. December 7th, 1941, I was a midshipman first class at the U.S. Naval Academy. And that Sunday afternoon, I happened to have taken a very attractive young lady to lunch. She must have been impressed because 4 years later she married me. But I came back from that date with my wife-to-be, and when I got to the gate of the Naval Academy, in those days we didn't have Marines or sailors on the gates. We had what were known as Jimmy legs. And the Jimmy legs were contract security guards, which we see a lot of today. And I knew that something had happened that afternoon because all the Jimmy legs were armed. They all had pistols and side holsters. And my question was, are they armed to keep us in or to keep the enemy out?
I was sitting in Griffith Stadium at the Redskin game. I was, I don't know, a young man then. But the thing I remembered, I suppose Griffith Stadium held 25,000 in those days. They very carefully did not make the announcement, but they took the microphone periodically and said, would Admiral so-and-so please call your office? General so-and-so, please call your office. And it wasn't until we got out of that game, I think it was the Chicago Bears, that we learned, when we turned on our little old radios in those cars, of that tragic event to the United States.
Oh, I have one question, sir. Did the Redskins win?
You know, one of the great things about being a senior citizen, damn if I remember.
Well, I couldn't either. That's why I asked.
Okay. Now, Admiral, you go to sea first. As graduating a year ahead, they moved your class up at the Naval Academy. Could you talk about reporting aboard, I guess, the Pavilion, was it, the ship you were assigned?
No, can you hear me? I graduated a year early, the first 3-year class of World War II, and I had an opportunity to ask for a certain type of ship. And in May of 42, I requested a destroyer, and by the time I had graduated in June, it had been sunk. So I was sent to a new construction destroyer. This was the USS Ringgold, and I served aboard the Ringgold for a year. I was an assistant gunnery officer. When I left Ringgold, I was a lieutenant, 22 years old, and had been qualified to serve as gunnery officer on new construction. So it was after a year on the DD 500, I went to the DD 662, the Pavilion, and where the Ringgold operated principally in the Atlantic, the North Atlantic on convoys. Pavilion went immediately to the Pacific, and it was aboard the Pavilion that I served as gunnery officer during the Surigao Straits battle.
Now, at this time, Senator, you're still a young kid going up through school out in, I guess, rural Virginia. Could you talk a little bit about the home front and what folks were doing to support the war effort?
Sure. But I'd like just to say with a deep sense of humility that I did serve in the Navy at the end of World War II, and I served in the Marines and went to Korea. But I do not ever put myself in the category of a hero. I just did my duty, stayed out of trouble, and got the GI Bill. And only because of my military training in the GI Bill am I here today as a United States Senator. And I have a heart full of gratitude for the opportunity that this country gave me. And today, in my 26th year in the Senate, I'm trying to do payback to our military. I have the most vivid memories of my group. It was the fall of 1944, and I guess in this audience is one or more who might have been in the Battle of the Bulge. And we felt, as a nation, up to that time, we were making headway. But that surprise attack and the horrific losses that were suffered in that conflict sobered America up. And everybody in my high school class in the fall of '44, the boys, no disparagement to the girls, but I just can't remember much about that. But I do know we all quit school and joined our services. And I wanted to be an aviator. So I joined the Army Air Corps and the Navy Air Service and waited at home till the first called me up, which was in January of 1945. And America at that time, we couldn't see the end of where it was going to end in Europe and much less the Pacific. Because as I was in boot camp, you had Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And today's generation don't realize the losses, say at Iwo Jima, were something like 18,000 casualties. Okinawa, higher casualties than that, close to 20-some-odd thousand. And while we are deeply distressed by every loss of every soldier today, America must remember the magnitude of those losses and the currents with which my generation, 17, 18, were swept into to go into our training camps. And when the war ended in Europe, Jim, that was May of 1945, we could see no end to the war in Japan, particularly after the experience of the tenacious battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And so my class was in training. I met a guy out here a minute ago. We were both trained as radio techs. I'd since flunked out of flight training because of air sickness, Admiral. And we were headed into the invasion of Japan when Harry Truman, I think, made that tough decision, which in the end saved many thousands of American lives and, frankly, many more thousand lives of the Japanese, military and civilian. So with that, the war came to an end, and we were headed to the Pacific when the orders were cut. You stay here, finish up your training, and go home. And that was it. So, like millions of others, there were 16 million of us in World War II. My class, the 17, 18-year-olds in the fall of '44, '45, we were ready to come take the place of those of you out here who had fought the good war, including yourself, Jim. We were ready to go. And you know, we had the support of every single person at home to do that job.
Senator, I do have to say that it was your generation that was prepared for the Cold War by World War II, and it was your generation that were the field officers in Korea. Another savage war, 55,000 Americans died in Korea. And it was your generation that were the leaders in the war in Vietnam, where the toll was 50,000 American troops. So, and you were in the lead of most of those leaders during that time. I'm very proud myself to have served under you when you were Secretary of the Navy and I was the senior military man.
Okay. Now, Senator, you were alluding to these battles going across the Pacific and how the war could have been going on. Now, one of those battles was the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, that's when the Japanese introduced the kamikaze, the suicide airplane that took out many of our ships. That's how brutal the war became. Now, the Battle of Leyte Gulf is a very complex, it's the greatest naval battle in history. It was a 3-4 day event, and one of the highlights of the battle was the Battle of Surigao Strait, where the battleships from Pearl Harbor have an opportunity, having been refloated, to extract some revenge against the Japanese Navy. And Admiral Holloway, being on the Pavilion, had a front row seat to this battle that occurred on the night of the 24th and the 23rd and the 24th of October, where the setup was that there was these straits leading to the landings at Leyte Gulf. On October the 20th, General MacArthur had landed, and he had fulfilled his pledge that I shall return. So the Japanese, to throw the Americans off the beaches, instituted this plan to distract the American Third Fleet, led by Admiral Halsey, away from the beaches, and then they would send these powerful surface forces through San Bernardino Strait to the north and Surigao Strait to the south. And to meet the Japanese Navy formations coming up through Surigao Strait, Admiral Kincaid sent Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf with the battleships from Pearl Harbor to cross this strait to form what's called a naval maneuver crossing the T. And he sent ahead these PT boats and destroyers to rim the strait to launch torpedo attacks against these Japanese cruisers and battleships. So with that set up, let me turn it over to Admiral Holloway, who was a gunnery officer on the Pavilion, so you can tell us what happened.
If I were to tell you it seemed like yesterday, I would be telling you the absolute truth. On the 24th of October, 1944, in the afternoon, the captain of the Pavilion called me down to the bridge and shared with me his message traffic that showed that Leyte Gulf would be the focal point of this tremendous last all-out attack by the Japanese forces, and that already one Japanese force had entered Surigao Straits to our south and would try to break through our screen of destroyers to attack and destroy as many of the 100 ships, merchant ships, lying off Tacloban that were loaded with the support for the Army troops ashore. We went to general quarters at about 5 o'clock that afternoon. We put the crew through the chow line. I went up to the director. We considered that we had a very experienced outfit. We'd all put the ship in commission together. We'd served together for a year. We'd been to Saipan, Tinian, Guam, Pavilion, and now we were at Leyte Gulf. In fact, only 3 days before, on the 22nd of October, we were blooded for the first time when providing gunfire support for the Army troops ashore. The ship was hit, the Pavilion was hit by counter battery fire, and two people were wounded. One was where you are, and one was where Dave Winkler was. I was spared. One of the officers was terribly badly wounded. He survived, but we had to make a few changes to our director crew before the action. That evening, Pavilion was made part of a 3-ship division and moved down into the strait, Surigao Strait, on the western coast. That's the Leyte coast, and it's a very rugged coast, so the 3 ships could sort of hide in the shadows and not be detected by the Japanese radars. Everyone was exhausted. I remember sitting up in the director, very hot, very confined, in and out of rain squalls, sailors sort of dozing off. We had to shake them to keep them awake. And then I was standing up in the hatch in the director looking south, and I heard a noise that sounded like summer thunder. You all know what that's like, very far away, deep rumbling, but it was continuous. And I then saw the telltale flash of gunfire. And while I was looking down there trying to make out what was going on with my binoculars, I felt a tug at my pants leg, and the sailor sitting here, who was the rangefinder operator, pointed to me, said, "Look through the optics." And we had very powerful optical telescopes that enlarged the target up to 10 times. And I looked through there, and what did I see but a Japanese battleship? And you'll may be amused at my reaction. My wife always says, "Don't tell this story because people think you're really dumb." But I said, I saw this pagoda structure of the mast, and I said, "My God, that looks just like a Japanese battleship." Well, of course, it was a Japanese battleship, but I had spent 4 or 5 years of my life, looking at recognition slides. And about that time, I saw a second battleship coming out. Following, the first was the Fuso, the second was the Yamashiri, and the firefight was sparked by the PT boats. We had 39 PT boats down in the Strait, and they had made an attack on the column coming through. I have to say that they didn't score a hit, but they alerted us gave us warning, so we were prepared. About this time, we were told to start our run in towards the launch point. Our plan had been our 3 destroyers steaming 300 feet apart with absolutely no lights, making black smoke, and the engineers loved that. That was the best part of the battle for them, because they were forbidden to make black smoke under normal operations. And with everything blanked out, we headed at 32 knots, running to the south. The Japanese force was coming toward us at 25 knots, so we were closing at better than 50 miles an hour. And as we broke away from the radar shadow of Leyte, the coastline, the Japanese picked us up. And it was a very eerie feeling, because we were not firing our guns. We were going to make a torpedo attack. But we were 20,000 yards away, which is the earliest that their 16-inch guns were accurate. And the ship, the Pavilion, was surrounded by these towering columns of water. You have to see them to understand. These were the 16-inch shells as they were exploding. None of them, we were not hit, but our decks were awash. And we did lose a man over the side because of the tremendous wash of water that from that shell. We were tremendously heartened, though, because about the time it looked like we were running into serious trouble from these 14 and 16-inch guns of the Japanese. Our own battleships opened up. Now, this was a sight that I have told people about for years, because I just didn't expect it. Every one of their 16-inch and 14-inch shells had a tracer on it. And overhead, we on the destroyers could see, just like fireworks, the shells from the main battery guns of our old battleships, and then looking through the optics, see them impact, hitting the Fuso and the Yamashiro. These shells took 20 to 25 seconds from the time they were fired until they hit the target. So we had this opportunity, everything almost in slow motion. When we got to 10,000 yards, we made preparations to launch our torpedoes, and I reported to the captain. I said, we have a radar lock on. We've been tracking the second ship in the column, the Yamashiri, which was our target. And we've got his course and speed down to a very accurate position. The torpedo battery is ready. All the amber lights were on. And the captain said, well, we're going to launch at 7,000 yards. I kind of wished he'd said launch right now so we can get out of there. But we launched we were the 3rd destroyer, and the first one made a right-hand turn, fired 5 torpedoes. The second followed in its wake. And we were the 3rd, so we were 3 or 4 minutes after the first ship launched, and we were closer than 5,000 yards to the Yamashiri when we launched. And as the torpedo tube swung out, we came around in a turn. I checked all the buttons, said, Captain, we're ready. He said, launch him. And I hit the firing switch and looked out, and 5 fish, big torpedoes, hit the water in succession. Every one of them, it's what they was a hot run. The engine started, and we could see the trail of the torpedoes headed toward the Japanese battleship. So with that, we had done our job. As we retired, we ran into one of our ships, the A.W. Grant, was hit and on fire. She was the ship that was just ahead of us. And we were taken under fire by a Japanese cruiser, the Mogami, and we fired back at her, but it had become a melee. We didn't know whether these radar targets were friendly ships or enemy ships. We got them all mixed up.
Did the torpedoes hit?
The senators asked the key question, did the torpedoes hit? And the answer, sir, is yes. Not all, but 2 of the Pavilions, 5 spread, hit the Yamashiri. And, but we had recovered the next as soon as light broke, we sort of got our force together, headed south, and a Japanese destroyer was getting away. She was on fire, but she had to be destroyed because that destroyer, like us, carried torpedoes that could be used to attack our forces. So we sunk that Japanese destroyer by gunfire, as she blew up as we passed within 2,000 yards of her. And at that instant, a Zero dropped out of the skies, headed right for us, and it hit a direct hit from a 5-inch gun. Now, people say that's almost impossible, but, we were lucky that day. And as we turned around and came back because we had destroyed the Southern striking force, and the sea was covered with oil, with debris. There were 5 major fires going. The surface of the water was covered with Japanese sailors, and they were crying. We didn't understand Japanese, and we didn't know whether they were saying nice things or bad things to us, but we did not stop to try to pick them up. We figured that they would wash ashore, and we sort of let the Filipinos deal with that. So by noon that day, the Battle of Surigao Straits was over. 4 days later, I left the ship, came back to the States, went through flight training, and became an aviator.
Senator, hearing that story, do you have any follow-up questions?
The whole time that was going on, I was in high school and only saw the movie-tone news.
Yeah.
Sir? By rank, I was a lieutenant, and I was approaching my 22nd birthday.
Okay, I'm going to ask Admiral one more question. First of all, Senator, do you have any more questions?
No.
Okay.
Listen, that's the grand finale.
Okay. You were the captain of the Pavilion, tried to keep you on board. What was your comment to him?
Well, he was a wonderful gentleman. His name was, he was Captain Joshua Cooper, and I remember during that entire battle, I looked down on him and he had his cap on at a jolly angle. He was standing out in the open, conning the ship, not wearing a tin hat, but wearing his commander's hat with a gold braid on it. Great destroyer man, and as I was leaving, going over the side, he'd let me use his gig to go over to the Kathleen Leyte, which was a supply ship that was going back to the States. He said, "Jim, you really ought to stay in the destroyer Navy. There's a great spot for you here. You've got this great background. Really, I hate to see you go off to flight training." And I said, "Captain, I appreciate what you're saying, but look, in 48 hours, we've shot down 3 Japanese planes, torpedoed a Japanese battleship, sunk a Japanese destroyer. What's there left to do?"
Did he make that?
Yeah. You have any?
No.
Okay, what I'd like to do is to kind of do the Phil Donahue routine here and take some questions from the audience. We have about 15 minutes left in this session. Do I have any questions?
To Senator Warner. Senator,
Aye, aye, sir.
Senator, you mentioned something that hit me sincerely, and I claim that this is one of the reasons why we are such a great nation today, is because of the GI Bill. When we guys came out of the service, most of us did not have anything more than a college education, and the government gave us the opportunity to go back to school, which we took advantage of. And I think that generation that went back to school became the lawyers and the accountants and the professors and the doctors of the generation that was so great. And I'd like to ask you, did you feel that the GI Bill was as strong a thing as I do?
I didn't get the question.
Is asking if the GI Bill was a wonderful program. Do you feel as strongly about the success of the program as he does?
Enormously. I got my first degree in engineering from modest World War II service, which I've described was inconsequential except in the training command. And then I got a law degree for another 2 years in the Marine Corps during the war in Korea. So I wouldn't be here today. The GI Bill is the greatest investment that America made at that time. And today, I make sure that every GI gets equal or better than I did. Thank you.
Other questions? Now, okay, let me go right.
Yes, appreciate hearing these stories firsthand. It's great to, having grown up in the 50s, we saw my generation World War II movies, but as usual, Hollywood couldn't do justice to the real story, so it's quite exciting to be here. Having come out of that 50s generation, growing up that way, when the 60s hit, and I found out that black veterans could not vote in the South, that was a great, great shock to me, having learned and had so much pride in my country. So I volunteered and worked on Dr. King's staff, both in Georgia for 10 weeks and as college coordinator for 3 years. And I know in the black community they called World War II the double V, fighting the war against fascism around the world and fighting for civil rights at home. And I'm wondering, for both of you, the military was ahead of society integrating in 1948. And as you had your military career, Admiral and Senator Warner, as you went into politics, did the World War II experience translate to you that at some point this country was going to have to deal with that issue and face up to particularly those returning veterans getting full rights and the rest of the society also?
Well, I give great credit to that man who was my commander-in-chief in World War II and again in Korea, and that was Harry Truman. One of the first things he did upon becoming president was to desegregate the armed services and begin to let the African-American generations have that opportunity that I had. And when I was Secretary of the Navy, we were still working on that, Jim, and I think it's something we always have to work on. But I'm very proud of the history of the African-Americans who have worn the uniform of the United States military.
I would like to add, I agree with every word that Senator Warner has said, but I would like to add something, and that is when Senator Warner was Undersecretary of the Navy, he was heavily involved. In fact, it came close as far as my observation went, that it was his primary interest was making sure we had equality in the Navy. And then when he became Secretary of the Navy, he was able to capitalize on his efforts and his previous experience to make what he had generated come true. And in the Navy today, we look back on the era of John Warner's Secretary of the Navy ship as a watershed in the improvement of race relations within our service.
Okay, question.
Hello, my name is Bradford Williams, and my father was on the USS Maryland battleship at Surigao. I was curious, could you tell the individual broadsides from the battleships in the sense of, you know, what ships had eight guns, which ships had 12 guns, that kind of thing? You know, could you tell the difference? Were you that close or not?
You go ahead. I think he's talking about the size of the gun.
Yes, USS Maryland had, my recollection is, she was a West Virginia class ship. She had 16-inch guns arranged 3 per turret in 3 turrets. Now, that's just a recollection, but let me, if you're interested in following through, I recommend you get Samuel Eliot Morrison's History of the U.S. Naval Operations in World War II, and in the volume on Leyte, he not only describes the armament of those ships, but actually lists how many rounds were fired by each ship. So you can look up and find out that Maryland fired 64 armor-piercing projectiles during that action, or something of that nature. I think it's wonderful that you have this great interest in that, and that's what I believe our program does, is stimulate young Americans to be proud of their heritage, and particularly their family who served.
One little footnote to that. When I finished my training, I was assigned to the USS Hawaii, which was a pocket battleship built midway through the war with a 12-inch gun. And the ship never slipped its hawse line. We stayed ashore because it was being decommissioned. The old gun club in the Navy, the battleship captains and admirals, never wanted to see a little 12-inch gun battleship again. And we destroyed 3 brand new battleships in the closing year of World War II because they didn't want them anymore. Someday we got to figure out why that happened. They were afraid Congress would buy the cheaper ship and never build another one, which they didn't do, as a matter of fact. That was the last battleships, was the Missouri, the New Jersey, the Wisconsin, and what was the fourth one? Iowa.
Yeah.
If there's no more questions, I guess we can secure the butts.
Well, I just got one point to add, is that on Leyte Gulf, you asked a good question here. There's an excellent book by Tom Cutler on the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Evan Thomas, who wrote a great book on John Paul Jones, is coming out with a book next year on the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And there's going to be a 2-day symposium at the Nimitz Museum in Fredericksburg, Texas in September about the Battle of Leyte Gulf. But, you know, there's so much on this topic that takes a whole 2 days to cover it, and probably then some. So, I don't know, without Ellen.
That's a good
Time for one question?
What, time for one more question?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Admiral Holloway. Over here. I just wondered if you and the senator would comment briefly on the long-term consequences of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. You know, for people who didn't live through it, what did it mean?
Broke the back of the Japanese.
Well, the senator said it broke the back of the Japanese Navy, and that's absolutely true, because subsequent to the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Japanese were never able to send their major forces out of their homeland. They were just then sort of relegated to Coast Guard duties. But I think there's another, the immediate effect was that had the Navy not prevailed at Leyte Gulf, I think that the entire campaign would have been slowed, I'm going to say at least 6 months, because the landings on Leyte would have been terribly disrupted. And as a consequence, I think the war would have dragged on for another at least 6 months, and during that time the Japanese would have been able to prepare themselves better, and as the senator has pointed out, the casualties would have been horrific. And it was, I think, that punch that got us rolling, and when General MacArthur said, "I have returned," he turned out to be right that time.
I'd really like to close with one of my many strong memories. My father had been in World War I and was wounded in France. He was a doctor. And military life was very much in the minds of both my father and my mother, who'd been a sort of a nurse to the wounded here at home in World War I. But I mention it because they were a family like millions and millions of other families all across America, who did everything to make that war effort possible. The support to the men and women of the armed forces was just all out. And those that stayed at home deserve as much credit as those who went abroad in harm's way. We couldn't have done it had not we had the rationing. I remember we got one pair of shoes a year. Remember that? And I remember my feet grew so big that the toes curled under. So I'm slightly deformed. But those are the days we all remember. And this nation, we've got it in us today to see us through this crisis we're in. And we're going to survive because here at home, we love liberty, we love this nation, and we got a generation that will take our baton as the greatest and carry on. So hats off. My mother lived to be 98, and my most prized possession today, it hangs in my Senate office, is the little sticker that was on our front door and on the front door of millions at home, which simply said, "We're proud we have a son in the United States Navy." Remember that?
And that's an excellent place to end. Let us give a...
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.